notion of responsible gambling, I'm certainly not the first person to suggest that the implication of the idea of responsible gambling is that it's the individual gambler who should be responsible and maybe irresponsible. That it's the emphasis is on the person rather than on the product. I think a lot of people have suspected that that's the implication. But there's a second implication of the notion of responsible gambling, which I think has mostly been missed, and that is it suggests that gambling itself is good. So the idea of responsible gambling stands in contrast not only to irresponsible gambling, but it also stands in contrast to no gambling at all. So no wonder the people who are in favour of the expansion of gambling want us to accept this notion of responsible gambling, because responsible gambling suggests that, yes, it would be a good idea if we were all gamblers. Now, why not? Let Britain be a nation of gamblers. Responsible gamblers, of course, not irresponsible gamblers. So, and I think that second implication has been missed. Harm minimisation turns out to be a thoroughly confused concept. There's a very interesting paper written in the International Gambling Studies 3 or 4 years ago by Ladouceur and a colleague from Canada, really unpicking what harm minimisation means in the gambling field. And what they point out is you can think of harm minimisation in a narrow sense or in a broader sense. In the narrow sense, what harm minimisation is about finding ways to minimise the harm caused by the activity without affecting the activity itself. So in the alcohol field, an example might be making sure that in pubs in England, beer is served in plastic glasses rather than glass glasses, so that when young British men get angry with each other at the end of the evening, which I'm afraid they sometimes do, and they want to throw their containers at people or put them in each other's faces, they're less likely to harm each other. So that's the whole point about that as a harm minimisation, is it's not going to affect the amount of alcohol that's sold. It's not going to affect the volume of drinking that goes on. In fact, it might increase it, because if people feel safer in pubs, even people like me might go into them if I felt I was going to be safe. So it might actually increase. It's certainly not going to reduce it. Similarly, if in a casino you put in some nursing attention so that if people have been there on the machines for 2 or 3 days and no one's approached them and no one's told them to go home, which was what we heard from some people yesterday in the consumer panel, and they fall off their stool or faint or need rehydrating, then that's a form of harm minimisation. It's unlikely to affect the total amount of gambling. But in its broader sense, of course, harm minimisation is likely to affect the total amount of gambling because it's going to affect supply or it's going to affect demand. So that if you have, as has been suggested in Australia, you have pre-commitment across the board, or if you decide you want to cap the number of EGMs in an area, or you reckon you want to restrict advertising of gambling as methods of harm minimisation, those are all things that are actually going to affect the volume, or likely to affect the total volume of gambling. And this, I think, goes back to the question I think Max Abbott was raising yesterday about, can we have our cake and eat it? I mean, is it possible to think that gambling can be allowed to expand and at the same time we minimise the harm? And I think my argument would be to that we probably can't have our cake and eat it, and that harm minimisation would need to be confined to those things like having a nurse there in case you fall off your stool, or ineffective things like education. And on the whole, educational inputs have been, in other fields, have been suggested as methods that don't work very well. But if you have serious harm minimisation in the broad sense, then you're going to have to accept that the amount of gambling will actually go down or not rise as you want. And that, I think, is something that in Britain the government has simply not faced. And there have been occasions in meetings where there might have been a minister present, and I've tried to ask the minister, you've commercialised gambling, you've opened up gambling, are you expecting, therefore, gambling to rise? Are you expecting gambling to expand? And I'm assuming he would admit yes. I mean, if it's an industry, I mean, why on earth would you legitimise an industry that contributes to your economy if you don't want it to grow? That seems to me to be a contradiction in terms. And if it's going to grow, do you really think that the harm can be minimised while this activity grows? And I think that conundrum, I don't think is one which, it's certainly one that the British government hasn't faced, and I suspect governments elsewhere haven't faced either. And then corporate social responsibility. Well, many people who've looked at the corporate social responsibility in the tobacco field, the alcohol field, are very sceptical about it. I don't think I need to say very much about this, but it's the idea that it's simply a conflict of interest. I mean, why would you want to address the harm caused by your product if, as a result, the profits you make from your product are going to use? Why on earth would you want to do that? Theories. Theories about the relationship between availability and prevalence. I've just put three there. There's the total, what I call the total population consumption model, and this is the very simple public health model, which has a lot of support from people. And this is the idea that if you make a dangerous activity, whatever it is, more available, there's going to be a rise in the whole population's engagement in that activity. And as the consumption in the whole population rises, so people are put at risk, and the prevalence of problems relate to that rise. So you've got a very simple, you make it more available, more people do it, more people get harmed from it. A lot of evidence for that in the alcohol field and other public health fields. Then there's adaptation theory, which I think was mentioned yesterday. The simple idea of adaptation theory, as I understand it, and I may have misunderstood it, but I think the simple idea of adaptation theory is that, yes, it is possible to think of the availability of gambling continuing to rise, and yet the population in some way adapts to it. And the theory isn't terribly clear about why the population should adapt to it, but various mechanisms one can think of whereby there might be better treatment services put into place for people who do run into problems with it. People might start to use the product in a different way. They might start to use it in a more restrained way than they were doing before. So it's possible to think that might be true, but that's the simple idea of adaptation theory, I think. And then, Max, you were talking about that yesterday, and your paper with others where you reviewed the Australian and New Zealand surveys to look at whether there was evidence for that. And my understanding, again, John, you'll correct me if I've got this wrong, but my understanding was that what you were finding was there was a lot of support for the total population consumption model, that over time it looked as if as availability increased, so prevalence of problems increased as well. There was also some evidence that as availability remained the same, so populations might adapt to it. But that was a lesser effect, and certainly there was no support for the simple idea that availability could be allowed to rise and the population might adapt to it. I have to say that I was suspicious of this theory right from the start, because it comes from a stable where researchers accept money from the gambling industry, and of course the idea that the availability of this product could be allowed to rise and yet we as a population might adapt to it is of course music to the ears of those who want to see gambling expand. And I think that's simple. I don't think there's any evidence for that simple idea, but there is some evidence that at least if things remain stable and there is treatment available, then we might adapt. But neither of those two things pertain in the UK, I have to say. We have a pitiful amount of treatment. There's one There's one new National Health Service clinic devoted to gambling in London now, but elsewhere there's very little indeed. So we have a pitiful amount of treatment. And also, of course, we're not in a stable situation. I mean, innovation and technological change is continuing apace. So we certainly aren't in a stable situation. And if we are likely to try and adapt, we're having to adapt in the face of increased availability and increased diversity of the types of gambling available to. I've recently developed a theory of my own called restraint erosion theory, which I think is particularly relevant to the British situation. It may be relevant to others. I hinted at it in my book, and I've developed it a little bit in a paper that's coming out in Addiction, I think, in the next few months. And the idea here is that we have actually had in place a number of restraints on our gambling in Britain. The majority of people, it turns out, do relatively little gambling. Even now, with the National Lottery, about a quarter of British people don't gamble on anything at all, or so they say, in the last 12 months. There's another quarter or so who do nothing but play the National Lottery and don't do any of the more dangerous activities. And even those who do engage in some of the potentially more dangerous activities don't do it very often. So it's not like drinking. I mean, the majority of British people drink regularly. But this is not the same about gambling. We actually have been a quite abstemious country when it comes to gambling. And in terms of attitudes, as I showed you before, we are really quite suspicious of gambling. So there are attitudes in place and norms in place that have protected us from gambling in the past. And I think the theory is that these are being eroded. Even the attitudes have changed slightly, although attitudes remained fairly negative in 2010, they'd actually moved in a positive direction, significantly so. Small change, but significant, between 2007 and 2010. So, in a way, if you want to be particularly negative about this, you could say the British people are being prepared. We are being softened up in Britain for the expansion of gambling and the continued expansion of gambling in the future. I call these complacency statements, and these are statements that are often made. I think they're all extremely complacent. The prevalence of problem gambling is very low. People say 0.9%. It's a trivial percentage. Well, it just happens to be about the same number of people, between 1/3 and 500,000 adults, and that's not talking about younger adolescents who are known to be particularly vulnerable. It just happens to be rather similar to the estimated number of people in Britain who have problems connected with Class A drugs. And you can't not provide a thorough service for people suffering from the problems of Class A drugs in Britain. There has to be a service in every area for it. So here are two things that apparently have similar sort of prevalence. One is relatively ignored and the treatment for it is trivial, and one of which is considered to be an absolutely top priority for treatment. So this is a big public health problem. It's by no means a trivial problem. It's largely due to individual vulnerability. The product's basically safe. Problem gambling is mostly transient. No, it isn't. It can be transient. People can get out of gambling problems quickly, but other people don't. Gambling is universal. We're a nation of gamblers. Well, we're not. A lot of us aren't. I'm going back from this conference very much stimulated. If yesterday was anything to go by, I'm going to go very stimulated and fortified to try and do something about this and to set up Gambling Watch UK.